Gran Canaria, the third island on my Gran Guanche bikepacking adventure. After days of heat and scorching temperatures, the weather took a turn for the worse, making this section of the trip the hardest one yet. I can't believe it's raining. It's just been like one scorcher of a day after the next and constant heat and no shade, and now I'm here. It's just 2 hours of rain and wind, so you just get everything here. But I think I'm okay. I've set up somewhere reasonably sheltered, battened down the hatches, so fingers crossed it'll die down for the morning. Thank you very much for watching my film. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment if you've got any questions, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. So I caught the ferry from Morrillable in Fuerteventura and arrived into Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. It was a few hours at least on the ferry, and I arrived about 9 AM, so it was a very early start. So I stopped up at Las Palmas de Gran Canaria, got all the food and water that I needed for the day, before following the route, which took me out on some really beautiful barrancos. Barrancos, as I mentioned in the last film, are like gorges or riverbeds, so they follow the lay of the land rather than it being undulating like you might get on some roads. And as a result of them being lower down, moisture tends to sink in there, so you get a load of greenery, which was really nice. I'd been bikepacking through the desert for several days at this point, so it was so nice to actually see some wildlife and some plants. I've got to admit that the barrancos in Gran Canaria were actually the best out of all the islands that I'd been on. They were sort of done as a bit of an informative walk / heritage trail, so every now and then you'd come across some aqueducts and some information which was really interesting. These islands have been occupied by the Spanish for hundreds of years now, but it's quite interesting to see how people lived there in the early days before electricity and the modern comforts we have today. So I followed a mix of barrancos and B roads and eventually ended up in quite a large town called Telde. And from there I rejoined another barranco. It took me underneath the bridge. It was quite a busy section of the route, but from there followed the barrancos again. I didn't see a single person for ages. I passed under loads of bridges and viaducts and camping / recreational places, which is really cool. So I felt very much at ease at this point. There was a lot of climbing this day. I basically started at sea level and had to work my way up to one of the largest mountains on the island. And that was my plan, was to camp right at the top in one of the forests. I was actually planning on camping at Pico de las Nieves, which is the tallest mountain on Gran Canaria. But as you've seen in the video, the weather took a real turn for the worst. I arrived at a little village called Las Vegas, and the weather just turned like that. It was really beautiful and sunny, and all of a sudden it started absolutely chucking it down and the wind was really strong. I was not prepared. I didn't bring a waterproof because I was doing a lot of desert bikepacking. I was more worried about overheating than I was getting cold and wet, which was a mistake, because when I got to Gran Canaria, especially at altitude, the higher up you go, the wetter it gets. I got really cold really quickly. I was working my way up the mountain really slowly, getting really cold, and at one point I just decided I'm gonna have to stop. A German couple approached me. They were hikers and they looked really miserable. They started speaking to me in German. I speak a little bit of German, and they said that the storm was even worse at the other end of the mountain where I was supposed to be going. There was no shelter, nowhere to sit or hide from the rain. So they advised that I start camping sooner rather than later, and it was getting dark actually. I had been going a lot slower than I'd planned. So I set up camp in one of the forests, as sheltered as I possibly could, but it really wasn't that sheltered. I was getting battered by the wind and rain for most of the night. Thankfully, my Nemo bikepacking tent kept me dry. This bit reminded me of Scottish summers, when you get a really cold, rainy Scottish summer. But I would normally have a waterproof or a warm jacket with me for that, and I just didn't have it. So I was really cold, and I was glad when I got into my sleeping bag and slept in a nice dry tent. I slept reasonably well and was really hoping that the weather was going to pick up so that I could carry on the route up to Pico de las Nieves and then down to the port, which is actually Puerto de las Nieves as well. That's where you would catch the ferry on the route to the next island, which is Tenerife. I mentioned in the previous video I was doing this in 2 trips. Because I've got a 1-year-old at home, it's not really fair for me to go away for 2 weeks, whereas if I break it up into 1-week chunks, it's a little bit more manageable. So the first week I did Lanzarote, Fuerteventura, Gran Canaria, and the next week was to be Tenerife and La Palma. So because the storm was still really bad in the morning, I didn't go down to the port to then try and find my way back to Las Palmas. I just retreated back down the mountain to the city, where thankfully the weather was much better. This section really caught me by surprise. Not only was it really physically challenging, but it was mentally challenging as well. I was so surprised at how cold and miserable I was the night before. I just wanted to pack it in and go home at that point when I was camping at the top. So for future reference, I'll always bring a waterproof, even if I'm going to a really hot country. I normally do, but this time I decided to forego it and I regretted it. So that's that for another film in the Gran Guanche. Remember, if you haven't seen the other ones, they're in the description now, or there'll be a card up there for you to click. Next month is Tenerife before heading on to La Palma, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.